Hi, I'm Sherri Goodman. I am a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Polar Institute, and I am the former Chief Environmental Officer at the Pentagon with the wonky title of Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Environmental Security. The book is called Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. And it takes readers onto the battlefield and inside the Pentagon to tell the story of the military's environmental awakening over the 30 years in which I've lived it, having worked with the military since my time on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff, almost a decade in the Pentagon, and another decade and a half at a military research think tank. And during that time, I organized a first group of generals and admirals to address the national security implications of climate change, where we characterized it as a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world. And we know today it affects us even in our own stable regions. I wanted to tell the story of how the military went from being seen as an environmental laggard when I joined in the early 1990s to a climate and clean energy leader, which it is today. And I wanted to tell that story so that the next generation would know it, so would know how today's military leaders think about climate and security, why they're acting on it now, and why it's so important. First of all, climate change is not just a future challenge. It is happening every day, here and now. A very vivid story is of Admiral Ann Phillips, who, when Superstorm Sandy struck in 2012, was commanding the Expeditionary Strike Group in Norfolk, Virginia, and it was her ships that had to be sent forth to New York to rescue the New York harbor commanded by the Coast Guard at Sandy Hook, which had been completely knocked out by the storm. And here she is helping her ships that were also affected by the storm and her sailors to go forth on a military operation to rescue Americans in New York. That's what the climate reality of today is. That's how our soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine are supporting Americans in today's climate era. We have to mainstream climate change into all of our strategies, plans, programs, and operations, just as all Americans do today have to understand, and everyone around the world have to understand climate impacts. And there are several important, let's just take three important categories. One is we have to be aware of the nature of those impacts. We call it sort of improving our predictive capability, because we can no longer rely on the past to predict future weather or future climate. Floods, 100-year floods now occur with every 5 to 10 years instead of every 100 years. And temperature is hotter with each successive year everywhere around the world. So we have to have improved ability to predict what the weather and the climate is going to be. Sometimes we call it closing the 1 to 10 year gap between climate and weather. And with increased technology, advanced technology, everything from AI to quantum computing, we are going to be able to close that gap. But we have to do it in a way that makes sense for the different types of decision makers. Defense decision makers need different types of information sometimes than a farmer, than someone who's running a railroad. But everybody needs climate-relevant decision-making information for their own work. Second, we have to adapt to the climate realities of today, because the world, unfortunately, is changing faster than we can prepare for it. So we need to adapt. We need to become resilient in our infrastructure, our built infrastructure, our natural infrastructure. We have to improve our shorelines, our natural systems. Everything needs to be made more resilient. For example, moving generators out of the basement if you live in a flood-prone area. There's lots of simple things that can be done, and there are more complex things as well. And third, of course, we've got to decarbonize and move to net zero. That is critically important. And the military, in many ways, is leading in its own efforts to decarbonize and become net zero, because for the military, it's not only about emissions, it's about the mission. And the military mission can be better performed in the climate era as we are more conscious of how we use energy and what types of energy it's going to take to get us to the battlefield. Because long fuel supply lines can make us more vulnerable to attack, as we found out in Iraq and Afghanistan, or as we prepare for another long distance, potentially fight in the Pacific. We need to be able to refuel quickly, short and agile, responsible, and fuel efficient. I want people to know that climate change is a here and now problem, but that we have solutions, and if we are smart about it, we can help our societies become more resilient, and we can leave a better world for our children's future.